Hello, this is Mike Crawley, and this is the International Political Economy class. Welcome. Today's lecture is titled Laissez-faire, the Economic Liberal Perspective, in which we study classic liberalism, capitalism, and predominantly Adam Smith in his work The Wealth of Nations. This lecture builds on that foundation of classic liberalism recorded in the Introduction to International Political Economy lecture on this channel. That was an introductory lecture. This goes a little more deeply into the hows and whys, into the mechanics of capitalism and classic liberalism. We begin with our seminar question. As is usual for this course, we establish the seminar question in the beginning of the lecture and then reintroduce it at the end of the lecture in order to provide the students context and hopefully a thesis statement from which to draw an outline upon which to build your essay as required for this course. The seminar question, as we're proposing, is to examine economic liberalism using contemporary Japanese and/or German economic policy as a focus. So, as we introduce classic liberalism and some of the key thinkers, some of the pros and cons of this interesting economic study, we will come back to our seminar question and reintroduce it. So before we dive in, we want to introduce some of the key thinkers, some of the political and economic philosophers, especially of the Age of Enlightenment, the 1800s, the early 1900s, who have contributed so deeply and so thoroughly to this magnificent study that we're examining today. First and foremost is Adam Smith, a Scot who lived from 1723 to 1790. And as we're going to see, his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, is going to influence much of what we study today. But he's not alone. We're also going to be studying other key thinkers, such as John Maynard Keynes, who lived from 1883 to 1946. You may be most familiar with Keynes from the economic philosophy of Keynesian economics that rose from his work. He was one of the Bloomsbury set and was a friend of Virginia Woolf. He was 6'7", kind of a tall guy, and was quite well known for his deep thought and his revolutionary economic ideas. We'll come back to John Maynard Keynes in a little bit. We're also going to be looking at John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704, and we'll be looking at his labor theory of property. We're going to be studying F.A. Hayek, Hayek, who lived from 1889 to 1992. We'll get introduced to Milton Friedman, who lived from 1912 to 2006, and to Charles Murray, who was born in 1943, and as of this recording is still with us. We're going to look at Joseph Schumpeter, who lived from 1883 to 1950, and one of his main claim to fame is as editor, one of the original editors of The Economist magazine, the British publication. He is going to coin the phrase creative destruction that we'll have a great time examining today. We're going to look at Max Weber, Jerry Muller. We're going to introduce Alexander Hamilton in a whole new light. We're going to look at John Stuart Mill and several others. So just an introduction to some of the key thinkers. Now, coming then to our slide that introduces economy, markets, money, capitalism, we remember that liberalism means liberty under the law. And so liberty under the law is really referring to a political system or to a political theory or ideology, but we know that politics and economics are often hand in hand, that economics inform politics and politics inform economics. They're almost inseparable. And so when you say liberalism or liberty under the law, we're going to be discovering how that applies then to capitalism. Capitalism as Adam Smith first envisioned it, and then subsequently as it's going to evolve. So today we're going to look at how capitalism works, its political prerequisites, its political, moral, and cultural ramifications for our society today. We know that liberalism focuses on the side of human nature that is inherently competitive in a constructive way. Thinking back to our comparative ideologies lecture, just prior to this lecture, we remember then that classic liberalism, as opposed to perhaps socialism or fascism or authoritarianism, one of the key tenets to classic liberalism as a political theory is the idea of the individual, the foundation on the identification of the individual and the individual's place in civil society, and as we're going to see economically, in the economic life of the nation as well. So we're going to see that liberalism in this sense is going to be guided by reason and not necessarily by emotion. What we're going to be calling enlightened self-interest, or what is best for Mike, what is best for me, and how best can I live, how best can I succeed as an individual in this political economic milieu that we find ourselves in. We introduced Quesnay in the Introduction to Political Economy lecture. You may remember him. And Quesnay condemned government influence in the market, saying that government getting its hands into the market, into the economy, is going to harm not only the market, but the individual within that market. Well, this then is the battle cry of the mercantilists. The mercantilists, we remember, are a subset then, a precursor to classic liberalism, a precursor to Adam Smith, and we'll be talking about them in a more thoroughly in a future lecture. But their battle cry was laissez-faire, right? This French term that we know so well, we've heard it so many times, and a rough translation is hands off. The invisible hand of the market will correct. The government doesn't need to get involved in the economy, in the market. Let enlightened self-interest, let this capitalist model then drive society. So this battle cry of laissez-faire then is what we're after today. It assumes, in a capitalist model, the efficient allocation of resources and the potential to reduce abusive state power. And so if the government's role in the economy is lessened, then the government's power is inherently lessened. And if the government's power is lessened, then there is less of a chance to have the government be abusive or to abuse its power, if that makes sense. The less power it has, the less likely it is to abuse the power that it doesn't have. You get it. So the theory of moral sentiments, then, is that commercialism produces righteous and prudent people. If we have enlightened self-interest, we're going to be wanting to do what's the best for us. And perhaps what the best for me today is to provide you a service that is wholesome, that is well structured, well crafted, will stand the test of time, and to provide a service to you so that you're receiving a good service. That's true, but for my end, from my vantage point, if I provide you a good service, you'll come back. If I bake an apple pie, and that apple pie is just absolutely the best apple pie you've ever eaten, you're going to be coming back for more apple pie. So if I can bake a better apple pie, if I can put more of my skill into it, then the more likely you are then to support me in the future. And so this is then what I'm suggesting, the idea that commercialism produces righteous and prudent people wanting to participate most fully in this capitalist society. As I said, passion is restrained by competition. And so I may want to make the best apple pie. Or perhaps I want to rest on my laurels. If I'm the only person making apple pie, how are you going to know if there's a better apple pie out there? That's where competition comes in, right? And so if the guy next door to me is selling apple pies that are 10 times as good as mine, then his apple pie is going to get you to come back. And so that competition then is going to produce a better apple pie. It's going to produce a better product at a less price for the consumer, for you. In capitalism, we remember one more time, it's a political and economic system where industry and free trade are controlled by private ownership. If the government is hands-off, if the government is outside of the market, then the control of the market, the control of industry, the control of free trade are going to be among private individuals, and the government then has little or no place. Now, John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics is going to update, if you would, Adam Smith. And he is going to suggest the need to prime the pump, that there are times when the government must step in to assure the economy's continuance. For example, during the Great Depression, when FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, took heed of Keynesian economic and actually invited Keynes to the Bretton Woods conference that we talked about in an earlier lecture, and we'll talk about again, consulted Keynes, had Keynes participate in his panel of economic advisors trying to create an out for the country from the Great Depression. And so priming the pump, Keynesian economics, was that mechanism. And Keynesian economics, this government spending, government getting more and more active in the market, in the economy, is going to be the foundation up until the 1980s, when Reaganomics and Thatcherism, so this is Ronald Reagan and his British Prime Minister counterpart, Margaret Thatcher, sought to reduce government debts, expand the money supply, and take us back to what was inherently pre-Keynesian economic model of classic liberalism, of Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations liberalism. So this capitalism then, as an economic system, is predicated on private property, the voluntary exchange of goods and services, and the absence of coercion or fraud. And so this coercion or fraud, as we're going to suggest, can be both from government or from other private individuals. So let's start with private property. The key thinkers that are going to be talking about this is first John Locke. Remember John Locke from 1632 to 1704, whose labor theory of property suggested that property comes about by the application of labor on natural resources. So I've given you my apple example. I am walking down the road or let's say through an orchard, that's a little more reasonable, through an apple orchard, and I find an apple on the ground. Okay, fine. That's a natural resource. Why is it a natural resource? Because I can't create an apple. Oh, I can plant an apple tree, I can prune it, I can feed it, I can water it, I can protect it. I can do all those things that will result in apples being created, but I, Mike, can't create an apple. So that is a natural resource. I, Mike, can't create oil. I can't create sunshine or wind or water. These are all natural resources. But what John Locke is going to suggest then is the application of labor on natural resources creates property, private property, and thus creates wealth. Here's how. So I pick up that apple and I combine it perhaps with other apples and make a very delicious apple pie. Now that apple pie is no longer a natural resource, right? It contains natural resources, apples, but I have imbued it with my labor, with my skill, perhaps with a finesse or ingredients that other people might not have thought of to create a delicious apple pie. Now, the more labor and the more thought and the more skill I put into my apple pie, and the better product that is, the more likely then you are to buy it. Now, what Locke is going to suggest then, this right to property predates government. Government's job is to, one, provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty. Now, we know this language, obviously, from the Declaration of Independence, right, and from the Constitution. But the idea is then that this private property isn't government's to give. If I am creating private property from a natural resource, if I'm baking an apple pie out of an apple, the government is nowhere in that. It is Mike's apple. It is Mike's apple pie. Government doesn't give me property. I create property through imbuing natural resources with my labor. Well, this is Locke's point. So another example then would be homesteading. You may know this term from a history class, but especially in the United States in the early 1800s, now Native American nations, extant in North America at the time, notwithstanding, and we know that, and I'm not arguing that at all, the idea then that looking westward from the east, the United States government and the individuals within the United States polity saw wide open spaces to be cultivated and to be taken, right? In other words, to take this natural resource, the land, and from it create property and wealth. And so homesteading was the idea that if I go out to Arizona or to Texas or to Oklahoma, whatever area, whatever region is under study here, and I staked out my 3 acres of land or my 10 acres of land, the government would allow me to do that either at very little cost or nominal cost, understanding that I would homestead it. And so I would take this natural resource, this land, this water, these trees, and I would clear the land. I would till the soil. I would build a home. I would build a barn. I would raise cattle. I would do whatever it took then to homestead, to create a farm or a ranch, and thereby creating property, right? My property. You gave me this natural resource, land, and I've created property from it. And now it's mine, right? By virtue of the labor that I've imbued it with, then this property is mine. And so, well, this is John Locke, right, saying that property comes about by the application of labor on natural resources. So the government, again, does not give me property. My right to property predates government's existence. So going back again to the Declaration of Independence, and I'm sure you know this as well as I, when Thomas Jefferson first drafted the Declaration, he originally said life, liberty, and property. Benjamin Franklin helped change that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that we know it. But the original idea was property, right? Going back to this idea, just this basic political ideology, that government's job is to protect property. Going back a little bit further to the Declaration, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men to secure these rights. What rights? These natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right. So, private property, Locke, the right to property predates government. 2, Smith, the ability to develop, improve, and exchange property creates wealth. Okay, so if you have property, and I thereby exchange it with you for something else, for something of like value. If I can create as many apple pies as possible and thereby get you to give me money, perhaps, or what other goods that I may need, my hard work and my labor that I'm infusing into this, the more late nights I stay up to bake pies, the harder I work, the more apples I collect. You get the idea. The more wealth I create, because property then, and the accumulation of property creates wealth. And so making sure that my ability, my freedom to develop, improve, and exchange property is inherent in our political system. It's inherent in classic liberalism, because I, as an individual, then have this natural right to create property and thereby to create wealth. Okay, I hope you guys are getting this, because this is going to become really important when we go back and talk about socialism, right? And we say that there is no such thing as individual wealth. Everything is owned by the collective. Everything is owned by the group, right? And so this is a starkly different philosophy, a starkly different political theory, between classic liberalism and socialism as an economic model. Another element defining capitalism then is voluntary exchange. And so any attempt to force certain exchanges or unnecessary limit exchanges are considered then anti-capitalist in the truest sense of the word, right? So we're talking about basic capitalism, core capitalism. As we're going to see in capitalism and socialism, through capitalism we have a thesis, in socialism we have an antithesis or an antithesis, and then thirdly we're going to have a synthesis, which is a combination of the thesis and the antithesis. So it's going to be capitalism and socialism, and it's going to combine to create a new animal, which is going to be parliamentary socialism, which is effectively what we have, and I'll talk more about that. So, attempts to force certain exchanges or unnecessarily limit exchanges then are anti-capitalistic, because if you're telling me that you're going to limit how many exchanges I can make, how many pies I can sell, well, that flies in the face of capitalism. You just said that the more pies I make, the harder I work, the wealthier I can become, right? But now you're saying, well, no, you can only have so many pies, Mike. You can have so many pies, Google, or Facebook, or Microsoft, or AT&T, or PG&E. You can only make so much money, and then no more. Get it? Okay, good. Now, finally, you have the absence of coercion or fraud. And so this, in a true capitalist model, says, again, that government's hands-off, laissez-faire. And so if government then is going to come into my workplace and insist that I only create so many pies, or insist then that I can only sell pies to X, Y, or Z population, then that coercion is antithetical to capitalism. Now, this goes back, really, this idea of classic liberalism, to the founding of our country, right? And classic liberalism, as I defined in our earlier lecture. There is a civic republican tradition in the United States that tends to underscore or be the foundation for this idea of classic liberalism and of capitalism. The civic republican tradition goes back to the founding of the colonies. Remember? And so you have this colony in Virginia or in New England, 3,000 miles away from England, right? Far removed from the centers of power, not represented in Parliament. And the model that they have to form their own local governance then is this church-based Puritan model, whereby you have a collective, a group of people coming together to form a church, right? A local church, and those people in that church then make the rules for how they're going to govern themselves, how they're going to worship, and how they're going to elect perhaps an elder statesperson or their leadership, or how they're going to conduct their existence. Well, that model that we see then in the Puritan churches in the early 1600s in the colonies are going to be the foundation for this Republican tradition. Now, this isn't Republican Party. This is Republican in its true sense of the word, meaning that the sovereignty, the power, rests with the people through the law. Right? The res publica is the Latin etymology of republic. Res publica is the public thing or the public law. And so it's the sovereignty resting with the people. So again, sorry, I digress. When I say civic republican tradition, when we look at how we conduct ourselves in a civil society, how we conduct ourselves politically, the idea that we are republican in that we hold the power, we the people hold the power, this tradition then underscores the defining nature of capitalism in this free society, in this democratic society. We next then go to our next slide, which is titled Undefining Capitalism. In other words, how do we define capitalism by what it is not? Well, as noted, capitalism is not opposed to helping the poor, nor is it opposed to the government helping the poor. Adam Smith is often misquoted, thinking that, government has absolutely no place in the economy. He didn't say that. He agreed that there's going to be places when the government must, when the collective must create institutions or to act, for example, with the common defense. So capitalism is not opposed to helping the poor, nor is it opposed to the government helping the poor. Adam Smith said, as the wealth of society grew, the resources collected by the government would also grow, and as the wealth by government grew, then the government's need to plow that money back into society, to plow that wealth back into society is increased, and so then would benevolence. That benevolence by the government then would increase. Now, Hayek, Friedman, and Murray all suggest that some form of basic guaranteed income provided through the government is not capitalistic. Capitalism does not require the consideration of trade-offs for various means of providing assistance. So work incentives, efficiency, requirements of efficiency, requirements of effectiveness are not going to be considered trade-offs then for capitalism or government assistance in a capitalist model. Now, Enlightenment thinkers debated the moral status of material well-being. Just because we're richer, just because we're more wealthy, doesn't mean that we are better off as a society. That cultures that have material progress seem to actually go the other way. They increase in inequality and they tend to undermine virtue. In other words, wealth, created wealth, both individually and with the country, with the civil society, is a good thing to a certain point, right? Where we, as a civil society, everybody can have a basic standard of living, subsistence level standard of living. But beyond that, then, there is a point when culture is lessened, that society is lessened, where material progress increases inequality and undermines virtue. In this, I'm thinking of the 1%, right? And as we're going to talk about going on in this lecture, especially when we talk about development in third world countries, this is going to be very true. When you're talking about developing third world countries, you have to be very cautious that you're not impinging on or actually harming the nascent culture. We also have the limits of market. Smith argued that markets cannot provide many of the things needed by a modern society, as I suggested before, national defense, a system of justice, or an infrastructure. Hayek argues that markets allow for significant disparities in wealth, as some will be more resourceful than others. So those people who are willing to work harder, ostensibly in a true capitalist model, will become wealthier. Well, that's the theory on paper. As we're going to suggest, though, that has its problems. And so when then does government have the authority, nay, the responsibility, to come in and perhaps through taxation or wealth distribution, take the wealth that's been created by the more successful people, obviously, albeit whether they got that through reasonable means, through honest means, or nefarious means, nevertheless, in a true capitalist system, then when does government have the right and the responsibility to come in and take money away from people, take property away? Hayek also suggested because capitalism is rooted in human nature, as long as human nature is flawed, capitalism will be flawed. And this goes to my point that people are inherently greedy as well. And they're also nefarious, and they also cheat. And so capitalism and this enlightened self-interest can only go so far. Right? That people are nefarious. People can be tricky and can cheat and hurt other people. Well, there might be a point then when government needs to come in and make sure that capitalism is upheld. Schumpeter also talked about creative destruction of capitalism. What modern economists might call innovation tends to make skills and industries obsolete. And so Schumpeter gave this great analogy, his observations during the creation of the textile industry in early industrial age England and shortly thereafter. Okay, so originally then the textile mills, let's say the woolen mills or perhaps cotton mills, were originally powered either by human beings or by draft animals. That the looms, the actual looms that helped create the cloth, the textile, were man-powered. They were powered by the human physical participation, that we were physically pushing the looms. Or having an oxen perhaps, or some kind of a draft animal create the energy that would move the looms. Okay, well, then we evolved then to water power, right? So you locate your mill next to a stream, and you have a water wheel, and now the fast-moving water turns the wheel. This is child's play, I know you get it. But think about it for a moment. As the water is now providing the motive force for the looms, what happens to all the people? What happens to all the draft animals? This idea of creative destruction. So you have a brand new method then of creating textile that's perhaps significantly more efficient, right? It's great, but it's going to displace all the people who were otherwise employed in the previous looms. And it goes on. So we go then from the water wheel, because the water wheel is going to be tied to its location next to a stream. You have to have the water power, right? Now, what if you had another source of energy, let's say steam energy, some kind of other kinetic energy, some fossil fuel energy, coal perhaps, that is going to drive a turbine that is going to drive the looms. Then you're no longer tied to the streams, and you can move your textile film for your textile manufacturing then closer to the population centers, where you can get perhaps more workers and create larger and larger looms. Well, this is exactly what happened in England, to the point where England became the dominant manufacturer of textiles and created much of its national wealth on the back of that. Well, this is again all creative destruction. And we're talking about industrial age England. That seems so far away. But now we have online teaching, right? And so I've been teaching online for over 10 years at this point, and so I'm an old hand at this. I still teach, I love to teach in person, what they call brick and mortar, right? But now with the COVID pandemic, all my colleagues are being forced to go online, to teach online. And so all these people who for years have been teaching in a very different style have to relearn how to teach online. Well, we think about this perhaps much as we thought about the textile mills. Well, what advantage then is online teaching to the student? What advantage is it to the system? There's a lot of great advantages to it. You can have less overhead. You need less infrastructure. You need less classrooms. Students can listen and participate at their own leisure. You can go back and take notes. You can listen to it in your car while you're at the gym. There's a lot of positive things to online teaching. I'm a devotee. I love it. But what is the creative destruction? What are we losing? That in-person instruction, that sitting next to somebody else in a classroom and sharing notes, the eye-to-eye contact with the teacher, whatever the case may be, you're losing a lot as well. So COVID-19 has been our steam engine, and it's created the need to go online. It's got a lot of benefits, and it's got a lot of costs, right? And this is what Schumpeter is calling creative destruction. And then this, I would argue, is one of the limits of market. All right. Good job, guys. So where we go now, then, are variations of capitalism. And so Dr. Jerry Muller, who teaches at the Catholic University of America, suggests 5 different areas in which visions of capitalism differ from one another. Now, again, remembering that economic models and political models often go hand in hand. As we talked about in our globalism and in our introduction to political economy lecture, and even in our comparative ideologies lecture, you can have different models of government and different models of economic systems. All liberal democratic societies have had capitalist economies, but not all capitalist economies have been liberal or democratic. Significantly, then, you can also have different styles of what we call welfare state capitalism, or systems that combine democracy with capitalism, developing into kind of welfare state capitalist systems. These come in 3 different flavors: conservative, social democratic, and liberal. And so in a conservative welfare state capitalist model, it stresses job production, high wages, and the ability of the male to be the sole breadwinner of the household. Now, this is true in many strongly Catholic countries. Remember, conservatism, as opposed to progressivism, is a way of looking at how we operate politically. Now, conservatism and populism are two different things, and they're often conflated. President Trump likes to label himself as conservative, and perhaps in some ways he is. I would argue that he's much more of a populist. And a populist, then, is much less conservative, I would argue, than even a progressive or a liberal might be. So we have to get our terms right. So a conservative then stresses looking back into history for models and for this when the country was the greatest, stresses job production, high wages, and the ability of the male to be the sole breadwinner. In social democratic countries, those stress government provision of social services and income supports for greater income equality for men and women. So you can still have a capitalist model, but the idea of welfare state capitalism, or at what point the government becomes involved in the economy, can stress government provision of social services and income supports for greater income inequality. So this would be like the call for a basic guaranteed income for all people in the United States. This would be that model. And this model you'll find in most Nordic countries, in Northern European countries. And then finally, according to Jerry Muller, we have liberal variation of capitalism, which offers government support to those who can't work in the market, has less stringent labor laws, making it easier to fire or hire employees. So this goes more to the heart of classic liberalism, of Adam Smith, laissez-faire capitalism. And you'll find this in most Anglo-Saxon countries, of which the United States is numbered. And so continuing our variations of capitalism, we also find different strategies for national development. In the Smithian strategy, we combine competitive free markets with international free trade. And as we'll go on in talking about trade and production and security, that is the meat and bones of this course, we'll be covering this in great detail. But you also have the Hamiltonian variation, and this is Alexander Hamilton from 1757 to 1804, who made the case for protecting infant industries in order to protect local and domestic production. He also argued for tariffs to foster and protect domestic production. So protecting infant industries, perhaps by subsidies and also by tariffs to protect them from foreign trade or foreign competition. And so the Hamiltonian version of capitalism stresses protectionist policies, high tariffs, subsidies, etc., in the transition from an agrarian to an industrial economy. There are also different types of business and relationship to government. There is the state-guided capitalism, where government attempts to guide the market and offers support to favored industries. We'll talk about this as we go on in our studies in this course. We also have oligarchic capitalism, where the bulk of wealth and power is held by relatively few individuals, families, or clans with close ties to the government. We're going to talk about that in Russia when we talk about global security. And we dive into Russia and Russia's economy, we'll be talking about oligarchic capitalism, which tends to prevail there. We also have big firm capitalism, where the most significant economic activity is performed by established large enterprises, and entrepreneurial capitalism, where small, innovative firms play a major role in economic activity. I would argue, as evidenced on this slide, that the U.S. is a combination of the big firm and entrepreneurial capitalist models. Now, capitalism does have tensions with democracy. There have been many non-democratic capitalist countries, but no liberal, democratic, or non-capitalist countries. Most Western nations become capitalist before becoming democratic, and so the economic model of capitalism predates the political model of democratization. The examples that I'd like to call to mind here are the Eastern European Soviet satellite states, who, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in the late 1980s and 1989, began to democratize, but before they became democratic, they became capitalistic. And in this sense, I'm thinking of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and a number of the Balkan nations as well, but especially Czechoslovakia and Hungary, were going to drive a capitalist economic model first at the fall of the Soviet Empire, and then quickly thereafter begin to democratize. Now, Hungary sadly has gone to a more populist government and has shied away now from democracy through the auspices of Viktor Orban, their leader. Czechoslovakia, as we know, broke down into Czech Republic, also Czechia, and Slovakia. And so this is an interesting examination then of the ties between an economic and a political model. Some liberal thinkers worried that democracy would lead to the destruction of capitalism, a la John Stuart Mill, going more toward a welfare state capitalism and eventually to a socialist model. There are three ways, though, that democracies support capitalism. If you think about the connection between the political and the economic philosophies, elections tend to make people more accepting of government, because if you're participating in the government, then you feel that you have ownership, you feel that you've had your voice, you tend to be more accepting of the government that's established. Democracy tends to reduce the more extreme elements of capitalism. Because we're all equal, ostensibly in a democratic system, because we're all equals, then we shy away from this 1%, the idea of the 1%. And so democracy then as an idea, as a philosophy, tends to reduce the extremities of capitalism. Democracy provides an informational feedback mechanism whereby the people talk in and amongst themselves about who they are, redefining who they are, as we're about to do in the upcoming election. We'll see in November who we think we are. Okay, so going on then to our next slide, capitalism also then has tensions with democracy, as rising standards of living produced by economic growth is conducive to democracy. Modern democracies derive much of their legitimacy from their ability to provide increasing standards of living. If standards of living are decreasing, if people are becoming poorer, then people become more dissatisfied with the government then, because we conflate the government and the economy in our minds. And therefore, if democracy is driving a capitalist system, if the capitalist system isn't providing goods and services to the public, or a rising standard of living to the public, the democratic response is going to be to change the government to allow that to happen. As taxes are raised, right, and we see our standard of living being decreased as we pay more taxes and more money coming out of our pockets and going to government, one of the reactions is going to be to force government or to compel government to reduce the level of taxes. So when politicians get on the stage and say, I'm for reducing taxes, we cheer. And we tend to gravitate toward that candidate. The Founding Fathers gave the origination of revenue bills, i.e. tax bills, to the lower chamber, to the House of Representatives, intentionally, because the lower chamber, having more members who represent smaller districts than the Senate, and who also serve shorter terms, 2 years in the House as opposed to 6 years in the Senate, are more immediately representative to their people, to their constituents. And so if you put the onus of creating taxes on that branch that is most representative and most accountable to their constituents, that kind of makes my argument for me. So, growing economies tend to minimize political conflict. If standards of living are going up, if capitalism is working, and we're all getting along, it tends to minimize political conflict. It's when standard of living is coming down that people get worried and get anxious and start acting strangely. Democracy without economic growth tends to exacerbate distributional conflict. In other words, if you see the rich getting richer and you're not getting richer, then this exacerbates the idea of distributional conflict. In other words, that the rich are getting richer, they're getting more money, they're getting more and more powerful at the expense of the working class, of you and I. All right. So our last slide for this reintroduction of classic liberalism, before we go into our case studies of Japan and Germany, we talk about unlocking the power of markets. And so Hayek suggests that prices rapidly communicate information that is widely dispersed in society. And so if the cost of bread goes up, if the cost of gas goes up, if the cost of internet service goes up, then that increased cost immediately gets widely dispersed in society. We all know it. We all feel it ostensibly. Schumpeter suggests that markets constantly require producers to improve. I'm not going to buy a bad apple pie. And so if you're creating a bad apple pie, I'm not going to buy it. And so you're either going to improve or you're going to go out of business, right? So this is basic competition. Schumpeter. It's the power of the market to help create the better products, to require producers to improve and to innovate. Locke suggests the use and development of private property improves its value. And Smith finally suggests that markets direct self-interest to socially beneficial endeavors and create positive social behaviors. All right. So, my friends, that is our reintroduction to classic liberalism. And now for the next part, the next half of this lecture, and we're at 47 minutes, 45 minutes, it's about right. We're going to jump into our case studies of Japan and of Germany. In the second half of our lecture, then, we turn to our two case studies, where we take the concept of classic liberalism and we apply it to nation states. So, first then is Japan, and the second is going to be Germany. The first case study, Japan, I would argue, is a textbook success story for capitalism. We remember Japan's part in World War II. And we'll be talking about this, but the unconditional surrender of the Japanese Empire at the close of hostilities in World War II left the nation bereft, economically, politically, culturally bereft. And so to come from that place then in 1945 to the place where it is today in 2020 is a significant case study. I would argue that few nations have come half so far so fast. Capitalism is credited, and free marketers present Japan as an example to emulate. 75 years ago, its war-shattered economy was little more than one-third the size of Britain's. Today, the Japanese gross domestic product, this is as of 2017, the last I've been able to get, or the most recent I've been able to get, is at 4.87 trillion. So their GDP is 4.87 trillion, which nearly exceeds the combined total GDP of Britain at 2.62 trillion and France at 2.58 trillion. And the gap is certain to widen still in the years ahead. If we look at Japan in its area, Japan is a little bit larger than Germany, but a little bit smaller than California. There are 5 major islands of the Japanese archipelago. Its population is 127 million, or about 4 times that of California. Pretty good life expectancy of 81 years, and 18.6% of the population are 65 or above. Looking at Japanese history, we recognize it as being one of the oldest continuous monarchies, having its establishment in 660 BCE. The monarchy was supplemented by the shogunate, which was a feudal military dictatorship under the emperor, a very weakened emperor, from 1185 to 1867. In this era, you had a command economy of 80% agriculture. When U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan to open trade in 1853, it fairly quickly caused what they called the Meiji Restoration, or the restoration of the power of the emperor in relation vis-a-vis to the shogunate. You saw a newly centralized government under the emperor, a new interest and influx of industrialization and trade, And Japan instituted mercantilism as an authoritarian stabilizer. In other words, mercantilism to uphold, to shore up the power of the emperor, the power of the throne. In Japan's participation in World War II, we know their invasion and annexation of northeast China, also known as Manchuria, from 1931 to 1932. We saw full-scale aggression in China by the Japanese from 1937 to 1940. And then finally in 1940, we saw their mitigated alliance with the Nazis in Germany and the fascists in Italy, creating the Axis powers of World War II, who were going to fight the Allies. And then in the Pacific War from 1941 to 1945, as we well know from Pearl Harbor, Japan invaded every country and colony in East and Southeast Asia. Following the close of the war, we saw demilitarization. Demilitarization was the intention of the United States as the victor to take the unconditional surrender of Japan and to create a new economy and to address the political system in Japan that had led to its militaristic nature. In doing so, then, the demilitarization following World War II purged almost all the wartime officers and politicians that had served in the Empire of Japan during the war. It disbanded almost all militaristic associations and parties. It prosecuted almost all war criminals, and we still have to this day a controversy with a Shinto shrine. We'll be talking about it with Prime Minister Abe here in a second. The Kasukuni Shrine, a Shinto shrine, which honors the 2,466 million kami, or spirits, that are housed in that shrine, and many of which are war dead. And so honoring that Shinto shrine is tantamount to honoring those people who participated in World War II. So you can see how that would be divisive. And finally, the demilitarization dismantled almost all war industries in Japan. In the 1947 Japanese Constitution, Article 9, consider the Peace Clause, suggests, quote, "The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. Land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained," close quote. So the Peace Clause in Article 9 of the 47 Japanese Constitution negates its militaristic future. That being said, doesn't mean that their economy isn't going to benefit from war. And the example that I like to give is the Korean War in 1950 to 1953. Albeit under the auspices of the United Nations, the United States predominantly became active in the struggle between North and South Korea, which was effectively an attempt by the Western powers, the United States predominantly, to contain communism. The economic turning point for Japan came with this Korean War, because Japan is going to be the ones who are going to supply Korea, to provide the war supplies to Korea. They're going to Japan are going to experience an industrial resurgence by virtue of this industrialization, and they're going to have a vast inflow of foreign currency to help pay for this supplying. So to put numbers on it, from 1945 to 1950, the growth rate of Japanese economy was 9.4%. From 1950 to 1955, their growth rate climbed to 10.9%, so a point and a half higher, or over 10%. In 1952, then, Japan's GDP, the gross domestic product, matched their pre-war high. So coming into the war then in 1940, 1941, to its conclusion in 1945 on the USS Missouri, then we have 7 years later, Japan's GDP matching its pre-war high. That is a heck of a resurgence, I'll tell you. Now, while political and military leadership in Japan were cleansed or purged during World War II, the bureaucracy was left fairly well intact, providing the foundation for today's nationalist movement in the main Japanese political party, the LDP. This is because the bureaucracy represented the aristocracy of old Japan, of pre-war Japan. And so it created an institution in Japanese culture that actually served the occupying force, served General MacArthur. And so they were allowed to stay. Again, with the Korean War, it was a political turning point for Japan. The United States started to regard Japan as a vital link in the arc of containment against communism. Demilitarization gave way to reconstituting a military force, albeit a self-defense force. And in the General Peace Treaty in San Francisco in September of 1951, where Secretary of State Dean Acheson served as the president of the treaty conference, we remember that both China and the Soviet Union were excluded from that peace treaty. This is important because when we talk about the peace treaties closing the war in Europe, the Soviet Union's participation in those treaties significantly muddied the waters, diplomatically significantly muddied the waters, especially in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans. The Soviet Union's demands in closing the war in Europe didn't help. Didn't help the future of Europe. So it's important to note that China and the Soviet Union were actually excluded from this. And that helped Japan. September 1951 treaty formally ended the occupation of the United States in 1952. It helped create the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty, and it allowed for U.S. troops and military bases to exist in Japan. So when we look at the government of Japan, we find a unitary, parliamentary, constitutional monarchy. That's a big chunk of change. We can break it down. It's unitary in that it is a type of federal model with prefectures and municipalities that help participate in government, but it is unitary in that the central government holds all the cards. It is parliamentary in that it is the parliament who creates the government. It is from the parliament that the prime minister and the cabinet arise. They are elected by the parliament. So it's a unitary, parliamentary, constitutional monarchy. There is a monarchy, there is an emperor, but that emperor's powers are limited by the Constitution, as is similar in England. Queen Elizabeth II is a constitutional monarch. She is monarch by virtue of the Constitution, so thus in Japan. So again, a unitary, parliamentary, constitutional monarchy. Say that 3 times fast. There are 47 administrative divisions in this system of government. We'll talk about these, but there is a cabinet, again, that is elected by the Diet, the legislature, and they are the ministers of state and include the prime minister. The prime minister himself is designated by the National Diet, the legislature, and then is appointed by the emperor, who is sovereign. Ministers of state serve at the pleasure of the prime minister, and so the cabinet, although they are designated by the legislature, serve at the pleasure of the prime minister. They work for him. They're appointed and named by the parliament, but they work for the prime minister. He is head of government and commander-in-chief. Now, all my wrangling about who works for whom is important because the Minister for Economy, Trade, and Industry has jurisdiction over Japan's industrial and trade policies, energy security, control of arms exports, and the Economic and Industrial Policy Bureau. So the Minister for the Economy, Trade, and Industry then is going to report to the Prime Minister. That person is reflective of the Diet, of the legislature, but he takes his marching orders from Abe. Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister, took over party leadership from the populist Koizumi, who left the country with low interest rates, high annual deficit, and a promise against tax increases. Abe achieved office of Prime Minister as president of the LDP party, we'll talk about that in a second, in a shift away from traditional mechanics, a reliance on local party chapters where national grassroots movements hold sway, instead of the traditional party factional maneuvering. So, as I suggested before, populism is often destructive of institutions, while nationalism tends to harken back to a nation's glorious past. And a lot of what we're seeing in the world, both in Hungary, in Czechia, and Japan, and to some extent in the United States, is this strange mix then of nationalism and populism under the overarching umbrella or the overarching banner of conservatism. And so the Japanese government then has at its center this strong central government headed by a cabinet or executive branch headed up by the prime minister. That being said, there are also prefectural governments and municipal governments. Before we get into that, let's get into the national diet. There is a House of Councillors, which is an upper house, which is effectively a rubber stamp of the lower house. The lower house, the House of Representatives, chooses the prime minister, passes the budget, and ratifies the treaties. Both houses are elected by parallel voting systems. In other words, they're elected individually and independently from each other, but effectively at the same time. The major political parties in the House of Representatives, the preponderance, the majority of which is the LDP, as I suggested before, Shinzo Abe's party, which is the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP. It is the conservative catch-all party, and all prime ministers since 1955 have been members of the LDP. Then we have other parties as a multi-party system that include the Japanese Socialist Party, which has a subset of the Japanese Peace Party. In other words, Japanese Peace Party is a smaller party that aligns and votes along with the Japanese Socialist Party. There's also the Constitutional Democratic Party. The Komeito aligned with NDP or the NKP. This is a religious party that is aligned with the LDP, much like the Japanese Peace is aligned with the Socialists. You have the Hoppe or the Kibo no To Conservative Party. You have the Japan Communist Party, the JCP, which is effectively anti-emperor, anti-capitalist, and anti-military. As I suggested before, the bureaucracy has a lot of power in the Japanese system of government. It is heavily involved in policy making by virtue of the Iron Triangle. For those of you who have taken an American government class, or perhaps my American government class will know, the Iron Triangle is the unbroken relationship between interest groups in the private sector, legislative committees, or the legislature writ large, and the bureaucracy, or those cabinet-level officers and cabinet-level institutions that serve the government. And so you have an interest group who is in line with the legislative committee that is making laws that are going to affect that interest group, as well as the bureaucracy whose job is going to be to implement or affect the laws that are created by the legislature. So this relationship then between these three entities then create an iron triangle, an unbreakable triangle of influence and cause and effect within the legislative process. My favorite quote from a Japanese bureaucrat: "Prime ministers come and go, but we are forever." Indeed. There is a judiciary, obviously, in Japan as well, and it is also hierarchical. There is a Supreme Court. There are 8 high courts, 50 district courts, 50 family courts, and 438 summary courts or lower courts. There are 15 Supreme Court justices who are appointed by the cabinet. Lower court judges are nominated by the Supreme Court and then appointed by the cabinet. But we remember that with the LTP's very strong control of government since 1955, their domination and manipulation of the courts are universal. As I suggested before, there is also a local government, but this is a unitary, not a federal system, which means that the central authority holds all the cards, holds all the powers. Any power given to the local authority is delegated by the central government, and any power that can be given can be taken away. There are 47 prefectures, or regions. You could say states would be a good analogy, each with a governor and legislatures. There are literally hundreds of municipalities which are served by mayors and city councils, very similar to what we have here. Local government conducts roughly 2/3 of all government spending and brings in about 1/3 of all tax revenues. As we shift then from looking at Japan's history and its political structure, we now tie it in from the political structure to the economic model. We know that Shinzo Abe, as Prime Minister of Japan, has been tasked with reinvigorating Japan's economy. As head of the LDP, this very strong party, he has very broad-ranging powers. He has the legislature in his back pocket. He is definitely working strongly with the bureaucracy, as the cabinet heads are appointed, although appointed by the legislature, serve at his behest and serve at his direction. So Abenomics, then, is a conjuncture of Abe, which is Shinzo Abe, the prime minister, and nomics. So it's his economic model. It's called Abenomics. Now, roughly, my friends, there are two schools of thought in economics. One preaches that if everything is left to the forces of free and competitive markets, then resources will be distributed efficiently, and that therefore it is more harmful than beneficial for the government to intervene in the markets through fiscal and monetary policies and through vigorous regulations. I made this point both in the original Introduction to IPE lecture and in this lecture about 40 minutes ago, so I'm sure you remember. Now, those who advocate this way of thinking are known as neoclassicists or conservatives. They harken back to pure capitalism, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations capitalism, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher capitalism. While they admit that taxation cannot be done away with altogether because the government needs money to fund public services such as defense, police, firefighting, elementary and secondary education, conservatives insist that income tax rates on individuals and corporations should be kept as low as possible, that an emphasis should be placed on indirect taxes like the consumption tax, and that social welfare should be reduced to a bare minimum in order to encourage self-help. Classic liberalism, classic, right? This role of the individual, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, obviously there's another side, right? Followers of the other school believe that it is an armchair theory to expect the free and competitive market economy to be efficient, and in that in the real world imbalances such as unemployment and instability such as economic cycles are unavoidable. Therefore, they go on to say that the government's market intervention through fiscal and monetary policies is indispensable to rectify imbalances and avoid instability. This second school is referred to as the Keynesian, right? Maynard Keynes, Keynesian or liberal school of economic theory. Concrete means of implementing the liberals' fiscal policy consist of raising and reducing taxes, increasing or decreasing investment in public works projects, enacting progressive income taxes in order to transfer a portion of the income from the wealthy to the poor. That should sound familiar, right? That should resonate. And making publication free of charge and getting the government to pay part, if not all, of medical expenses. As for monetary policy, liberals try to cool an overheated economy or to buoy the economy through the manipulation of interest rates by the central bank. In the United States, that would be the Fed. In Japan, it's going to be the Bank of Japan. So the ultimate goal of the liberals is to attain a fair and equitable society under the slogan of full employment, eradication of poverty, and the relief for the socially weak and environmental protection. Not a bad goal. We can see how both these schools of thought have the country's best interest at mind, the best interest at heart. They just think that will come about differently, right, from different models, whether a conservative or a progressive model. In the United States, the Republicans tend to push economic policies of the conservative school, and the Democrats tend to prefer those of the liberal. In Britain, the conservatives follow the economic policies of the conservative school, and the Labour Party follow the more liberal school. In Japan, Prime Minister Nakasone and Koizumi, the predecessors, the prime ministers prior to Abe, followed the policies of the conservative school. Under his favorite theme of carrying out administrative reform, Nakasone turned the nation towards small government and succeeded in privatizing the Japanese National Railway, the Nippon Telegraph and Telegraph Public Corporation, and Japan Tobacco and Salt Public Corporation. Koizumi pushed the slogan of structural reform and enforced derogatory measures and privatized the three branches of the nation's most postal service operations: mail, savings, and insurance. Both Nakasone and Koizumi were genuine conservatives. Although they followed free market ideologies in their economic policies, on the political front they were second to none in honoring tradition and order. Indeed, they never gave up the idea of paying homage to the Japanese war dead at the Yasukuni Shrine that I referred to before. During its reign of power for 3 years and 3 months, from September 2009 to December 2012, the Democratic Party of Japan did not make clear its liberal posture. On the contrary, the DPG made the blunder of betting its political life on the most non-liberal legislative bill to raise the consumption tax rate. What the DPJ had expected to do was run government devoted to sustainable economic growth, the elimination of income inequality through tax reform and fiscal spending, the eradication of regional disparities, free education, and environmental protection. The failure to live up to these expectations shortened the life of the DPJ administration and lowered the party's approval rating, which is now below 10%. In other words, they failed, and they failed miserably. Bold monetary policy constitutes the first arrow of Abenomics. This policy consists in the Bank of Japan setting a target of achieving an annual inflation rate of 2% within 2 years and making unlimited purchase of government bonds from banking institutions. An increase in the monetary base attained through this step would firmly embed inflationary expectations in the minds of the public, thus stimulating household spending on consumer items and investment in housing, and business spending on capital investment. In fiscal 2013, consumer prices rose by 0.4%, and in the ensuing fiscal year went up 2.7%, which was still less than the pre-percent point increase in the consumption tax rate. For fiscal year 2015, consumer prices were projected to rise by less than 0.5%. At the end of 2015, national bonds in the hands of the Bank of Japan ballooned to nearly 30% of the nation's outstanding government bonds. Moreover, the central bank had started purchasing investment securities issued by the Japanese Real Estate Investment Trust in an attempt to put the brakes on falling land prices. The central bank has also begun buying exchange-traded funds, or ETFs, to shore up the stock market. Needless to say, both are high-risk assets. The easy money policy of unconventional dimensions, as Board of Japan Governor Kururu calls it, has had the immediate impact of raising stock market prices and lowering the value of the yen against the dollar. High stock prices have prompted the wealthy to spend money on high-price items, while the cheap yen has served to boost sales and profits of export-oriented corporations. The cheap yen has also led to a sharp increase in the number of foreign visitors to Japan. Their annual inbound consumption, estimated to reach between 2 and 3 trillion yen, has served to make up for sluggish consumption by Japanese households. All told, however, the prevailing economic situation in Japan is undoubtedly far from the virtuous circle envisioned by the government and the Bank of Japan. That the easy money policy of unconventional dimensions would create inflationary expectations among the public, stimulating domestic demand, and eventually leading to inflation and thus economic growth. The second arrow of Abenomics is called flexible fiscal policy, and it has not lived up to its reputation either. Nor has anything remarkable emerged from the growth strategy to encourage private sector investment, which constitutes the third arrow in the 3 years since Abenomics made its debut. From the outset, American Keynesian economists like Paul Krugman have highly praised Abenomics. In contrast, Martin Fieldstein and other genuine neoclassical economists labeled it bad policy. After all, Abenomics is truly Keynesian in that it is based on the assumption that fiscal policy and monetary policy are effective. But it does not necessarily attach importance to helping the weak or rectifying disparities between rich and poor. Also conspicuous is its strong tendency to make light of market forces and to control the economy as exemplified by Abe's personal call on the private sector to raise wages and increase investment. In addition, the Prime Minister has been pursuing genuine conservatism, as evidenced by his steamrolling through the Diet the State Secrets Bill and the Security Bill that includes self-defense forces' participation in collective self-defense, and by his intention of revising the Constitution. Abe's policies, aimed at imposing more control in both the political and economic arenas, cannot be called either conservative or liberal. They can perhaps be most appropriately called state capitalism, as exercised in countries like China, Russia, and Singapore. Okay, so having looked then at Japan's political and economic structure and its shift from capitalism to mercantilism by virtue of Abenomics, we now turn to our second case study, politics in Germany. We're talking about the reunited Germany, right? The Federal Republic of Germany, that which came after the reunification of Western Germany and Eastern Germany. Germany has a population of 82 million. It is the most populous country in Europe except for Russia, and 68 million of those 82 million lived in what is the former West Germany. Its area is about 3 times that of Mississippi. Britain is about 2/3 the size of Germany, and Germany is about 2/3 the size of France. Germany is a world power. It is the 4th largest economy in the world, only behind the US, China, and Japan, and it is without reservation the largest economy in Europe. We remember its historical legacy in that Germany had a late development as a nation state, at least in relation to the other Western European nation states, and even that of Russia. Its creation as a nation and a state didn't happen until 1870, and indeed twice if you think about the reunification of East and West Germany in 1990. It had late development in industrialization, in democratization, and in its consolidation of democracy. Its remarkable achievement is in its post-war economic development and in its post-war democratic consolidation. In building the nation-state, we harken back then to the Second German Empire of 1871, or the first original German unification. It was marked by industrialization, but was devastated in World War I that happened between 1914 and 1918. Following World War I, the institution of the Treaty of Versailles closed World War I, instituted what is known as the Weimar Republic of 1919. It was Germany's first real experience with democracy, but it had economic problems. First and foremost were the expectations of war reparations imposed on it by the victorious powers. In other words, they had to pay the damages that World War I brought about to the victorious powers. And so if you're trying to rebuild an economic model, if you're trying to rebuild a nation's economy, extracting vast sums for reparations, while it makes sense politically, surely, especially in the world stage, doesn't make sense economically. It had other economic problems, such as the world's Great Depression of 1929, and then finally the rise of the Nazis in 1933. That was actually a response to both the war reparations, the Treaty of Versailles, and the Great Depression. And so democracy broke down, and the Weimar Republic lost its popular and elite support. The Nazi Party won 33% of the popular vote in 1932, And the institutions, the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic, were dismantled then as well, bringing us to the Third Reich of 1933 to 1945 and World War II that ensued at the hands of Hitler and the Nazi Party. Fast forwarding then to the end of World War II, and as with Japan, the unconditional surrender of Germany, we find Germany in ruins, both politically, economically, and culturally. So many military and civilian deaths destroyed the heart of the economy of Germany. Its industry and its transportation were destroyed. I mentioned earlier that the Soviet Union, by virtue of being first on the site in coming into Germany from the east through occupation, effectively occupied Germany and was known to cart off as reparations entire factories, entire trains, and just ripping everything out of Germany and carrying it to the Soviet Union under the guise of reparations. Although the Allies hadn't agreed quite yet from the Potsdam Conference about what the reparations would be, what the value would be, who would get what, etc. The Soviet Union just kind of took matters in hand and took everything that wasn't nailed down. Well, this is going to further debase the economy. I mean, if you have so many military and civilian deaths, if you have so little infrastructure, if your industry and your transportation systems are destroyed, topping on that, one of the worst famines, one of the worst winters in 1944, 1945, that just devastated the food supply across Europe totally. And we'll talk about the EU and the Marshall Plan in a future lecture. But suffice it to say, Germany was in ruins. Furthermore, Germany was divided into West Germany and East Germany. So originally, East Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union, and that included Berlin. Berlin was deep in East Germany. But the Allies, the other Allies, the United States and the United Kingdom, also took thirds of Germany as occupied territory, and then the United States broke off a part of its occupational territory and gave it to France to occupy. France wasn't a victorious ally. It was considered an occupied nation, but the historical and the cultural and the political ramifications of allowing France to help occupy Germany was vastly important as well. So Germany was basically divided into West Germany, France, England, and the United States, coming to be known as the Federal Republic of Germany, and East Germany, dominated by the Soviets, that was known as the German Democratic Republic. Both were formed in 1949. Both had an economic miracle from the 1950s and the 1970s, coming from what its starting point was. It sustained an unprecedented economic growth, although East Germany still lagged behind. Both were integrated into alliances. West Germany was integrated into the European community and into NATO. The Warsaw Pact, that was headed up by the Soviet Union, was the Soviet bloc's answer to NATO, creating a Warsaw Pact or an alliance, a military alliance to combat or to counterbalance NATO. And so East Germany then was part of the Warsaw Pact. The Marshall Plan, which was also known as the European Recovery Program, the ERP, was to talk about the recovery of Europe and to oppose the recovery of Germany as being nonsense. People can have both or they can have neither. George Kennan, who is a marvelous diplomat and a statesman, writing on behalf of the State Department, was one of those who were arguing for the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was, in effect, relief bill created and funded by the United States for Western Europe to rebuild Western Europe's economy, to provide food and sustenance for the starving peoples of Europe following World War II. It was actually President Truman's plan, but President Truman was very unpopular in Congress, And so they named it the Marshall Plan so as to take Truman's stamp off it, knowing that it would be more likely to pass congressional muster if it didn't have Truman's name on it. So pure politics. The Marshall Plan had a great effect on Western Europe's evolution. It encouraged economic integration that led at first to the creation of the European coal and steel community among 6 nations, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. This is going to become the seed of the European Economic Community, and from there to become the EU. So the Marshall Plan, this European Recovery Program, was the genesis, was the seed for the future European Union. Really, it helped more psychologically than economically. People were starving, they were homeless, they needed immediate sustenance, immediate support, and it was also a way for the United States, through relief and through foreign spending, to actually make friends with Western Europe. And why I mention this is Western Germany took part in the Marshall Plan, whereas the Soviet Union, decrying the Marshall Plan as a capitalist plot, shied away from participating in the Marshall Plan. And so the economic recovery stimulus that came to Western Germany did not come to Eastern Germany, causing a pretty serious demarcation between the two. We have German reunification in 1990. The impact of Soviet politics and Gorbachev's reforms in the 1980s are written all over East Germany's history. The GDR opened the Berlin border in November of 1989. The GDR's first re-election, this is Eastern Germany, was in March 1990, and the reunification with the Federal Republic of Germany occurred in October of 1990. So we have a reunification of Germany in October of 1990. Germany is also a federal system. It is called the Federal Republic of Germany. It's a federal government that is called the Bund, and the 16 states that are called the Länder. There are other federal systems that we're going to study in the context of this course, namely in the United States, and other unitary systems that are not federal by nature. We mentioned Japan as being a unitary system. It's not the only one. Great Britain and France are also unitary systems. So, this Federal Republic of Germany that is divided into 16 states. There are 10 states in the west and 6 states in the east, including Berlin. Obviously, there are differences in historical traditions, social structure, dialect, and economy. So we have state jurisdiction then in education, culture, law enforcement, and regional planning. And it has more governmental overlap in the United States. So I was going to suggest that state jurisdiction in education, culture, law enforcement, and regional planning is very similar to that we find in the United States. Unsurprising then that to some extent the German constitutional system would be modeled on that of the United States, but there is more governmental overlap than in the U.S. It is a parliamentary system. There is a central institution of the federal government, the parliament. It's a bicameral or 2-chamber parliament with a lower house, the Bundestag, and the upper house, which is the Bundesrat. There is a chancellor who is a chief executive. Angela Merkel, as we know, is the chancellor right now. There is also a president who is a head of state and performs more of a ceremonial role than an active political role. In the bicameral parliament, the Bundestag is the primary legislative body. It has 669 deputies and is directly elected by the people. The Bundesrat represents state governments at the federal level, which is what the Senate in the United States originally did before the progressive reforms of the early 1900s. It has 69 members, 3 to 6 per state, and the state representatives are actually appointed by the state government. They are not elected by the German polity. In German parties, similar to the parties in Japan, we have the Social Democratic Party, or the STP, which is left of center. It is the ruling coalition since 1998. It was originally Marxist that evolved to work with liberal capitalism. You also have the Christian Democratic Union, or the CDU, and Christian Social Union, CSU, which are both center-right parties. You have Free Democratic Parties, or the FDP, which is center-right and is the former German Democratic Party, or the GDP. You have Alliance 90 and the Greens, which are a combined party, which are the West and East Greens, who merged in 1990, and obviously they are left. You have the Left Party, which is obviously left-leaning and populist at that. And you have the Alternative for Germany, which is the AfD, which is right to far right or nationalist populist. And so Federal Chancellor or Prime Minister Angela Merkel, the Chancellor defines government policy. The Chancellor controls the cabinet. There are 14 federal ministers, and the Chancellor recommends the formal appointment or dismissal of the ministers. There is formal policy guidelines, and they are legally binding. Composition of the cabinet is a major issue in building a multi-party government. And so in building party cohesiveness between parties, coalition, having representatives of the minor parties or the minority parties on the cabinet is very important and helps provide pluralism in the system of government. The current president then of the German Republic then is the president elected by the Federal Convention, an electoral body that consists of all members of the current Bundestag and an equal number of electors who are elected by the 16 state parliaments. And so it's a honorific head of state, really no political power, that is elected by the lower chamber and an equal number of electors from the 16 state parliaments. Much as with Japan, there is a federal constitutional court that reviews the constitutionality of legislation. It limits the decision-making power of the Bundestag. Its constitutional issues are often brought before it, including constitutional complaints filed by individuals, actual court cases referred by a lower court, and federal or state governments or one-third of the Bundestag deputies can request a review of a law. In Germany, we have state capitalism. We have the state ownership of the means of production within a state. The state has considerable control over the allocation of credit and investment. And some examples of this kind of state capitalism include corporatized government agencies and states that own controlling shares of publicly listed corporations. Now, German capitalism allows for corporatism. Cooperation between government and interest groups is an important part of corporatism, or when government and interest groups or corporations combine to help create policy on behalf, or for the nation on behalf of the electorate. Social interests are thuswise organized into organizations. A single association can represent an entire social sector, and obviously associations are hierarchically structured. Now, there are peak associations or associations that have more influence and more power than others. The two that I can best describe are the German Federation of Trade Unions, which would be similar to our AFL-CIO. It has over 8 million members and 11 unions. And so the German Federation of Trade Unions actually participating in policy development with the German government is an example of corporatism. You have Confederation of German Employees Associations, which are 80% of entrepreneurs. This represents employers as negotiating partners of the trade unions. They're the other side of the trade unions. Interest groups and their participation is an integral part of the German political process. Interest groups are actually welcomed as necessary participants in developing policy. They are formally involved in the policy process. Government contacts relevant groups when formulating new policies. They bring them in to participate in that development. They perform a formal advisory role in public administration and in the discussion and negotiation of policy plans. This is an organized capitalism. It is a unique model of combining the state and market. A social market economy, then, is an economic system based on the free market, operated in conjunction with state provision for those unable to sell their labor, such as people who are elderly or unemployed. And it often blurs the distinction between the public and the private sector. And so in a social market economy, this model was implemented after World War II in West Germany. The social market economic model is based on the idea of realizing the benefits of a free market economy, such as economic performance and a high supply of goods, but it hopes to avoid the disadvantages, such as market failure, destructive competition, concentration of economic power, and the antisocial effects of market processes. And so we have then what we call Germany's reluctant capitalism. It is effectively corporatism. It is effectively a social market economy that seeks to combine the best of free market, the best of The Wealth of Nations and Adam Smith, while correcting for its failures, while correcting for destructive competition, concentration of economic power, and antisocial effects. And so, in this study, I compared types of industrial capitalism with a view to identifying both convergence and divergence between countries. And so we've looked at Japan, and now we're looking at Germany, trying to wrap our arms around what is capitalism. Having taken the position in earlier elements of this lecture that a country's economy relies on the relationship between business and state, I established that private enterprise, the basis of industrial capitalism, varies depending on how such businesses respond to government policies. The debate on the role of the state in the economy has, in recent times, led to distinctive divisions and patterns. The Anglo-American approach, generally identified with the neoliberal position, the classic Reaganomics Thatcherist position, views markets as efficient and advocates a minimal role for the state in the economy, while the German and Japanese approach advocates a balanced approach where the state and the market work in cooperation. Both sets of countries are essentially capitalist, with a democratic political system within which the market remains the basic for economic exchange. The difference, however, lies in their view of the state in the economy. While the former envisages a minimal role for the state encouraging competition as the only way for economic survival of individual enterprises, the latter favors an active role for the state encouraging greater cooperation between the state and the economy. Right? And so the differences then between Japan and Germany, although they're both vastly successful in rising from the ashes of World War II, economically, politically, etc., then, if Germany is the most powerful economy in Europe, and Japan is one of the four major economies of the world, how the heck did they do this? Right? How did they rise phoenix-like from their ashes to achieve this? Much of the beauty of capitalism is in its ability to be crafted to suit different cultures, politics, political systems, times, and contexts. For instance, in recent years, capitalism with Chinese characteristics, or the uneasy partnership of state-run industry, repressed liberties, and frenzied entrepreneurialism has emerged as a fruitful variant. In the 1980s, the Japanese model, which featured lifetime employment and cross-ownership to shield companies from shareholder pressures, seemed the way to go. The East Asian model fueled what they call the tiger economies of the 1990s, and ultimately the Asian financial crisis, by fusing flexible labor markets and low barriers to both trade and capital flows. And before the capital financial crisis, Anglo-American capitalism prevailed, with its low taxes, sharp competition, light touch regulation, and relatively stingy social safety. There are others. The French strain stresses the need for national champions backed by the states. Sweden's market system supports generous social spending. And then, of course, there's the German model. German capitalism traditionally commingled elements that seemed impossibly antithetical to outsiders: muscular unions and corporate efficiency, high-cost workers who can compete in global manufacturing, generous unemployment benefits, and low levels of unemployment, a fragmented base of independent small and medium manufacturers able to compete on the highest levels of productivity and efficiency. For its apparent paradoxes, one fact is increasingly clear. German capitalism is winning. Germany is no longer the sick man. While large chunks of Europe slogged through some of the worst economic conditions since World War II, things in Germany have seemingly never been better. Unemployment hovers at near record lows as exports clamber to record highs. Deficits, debt, inflation, and interest rates are all minuscule. Consumer sentiment hasn't been this upbeat since 2001. Since the global financial crisis of 2008, Germany, derided in the late 1990s as the sick man of Europe by The Economist magazine, has generated the best economic growth of any big, rich economy. The International Monetary Fund estimates Germany's per capita GDP will grow 1.3% on average between 2007 and 2016, outpacing rates of 0.8% and 0.7% for the US and Japan, respectively. And Germany's performance stacks up against fast-growing emerging markets, too. Germany recently overtook China as the world's largest surplus economy. Germany posted another record trade surplus just last year. Elsewhere, Germany's corporate sector is flexing its muscles too. In Britain, the entry of low-cost German grocery chains are winning over buyers and leaving long-time market leaders such as Safeway and Tesco in disarray. Cash-rich German companies went on a buying spree, announcing roughly $170 billion in acquisitions, including high-profile purchases by Teutonic titans Siemens and Merck. After notching a distribution deal with Walmart to put its Persil detergent on the shelves, Germany's Henkel AG is challenging Procter & Gamble's Tide, the long-dominant high-end U.S. laundry detergent. In the first half of 2015, Volkswagen realized its long-held goal of overtaking Toyota to become the world's top automaker by unit sales. Germany has a particular formula for economic success, and there are historical moments when that formula works well and other moments when it works less well. This is the historical moment when it works well, and it's often imitated. Germany's rise is an economics Rorschach test. Observers of all political stripes interpret Germany's economic strength as vindication of their own particular policy prescriptions. Embattled U.S. manufacturing workers spotlight the central role of trade unions in Germany's economy, at the very same time that right-leaning free marketers stress that the percentage of workers who are actually covered by industry-wide union agreements has declined, and that unemployment benefits have been cut in recent years, boosting incentives for work. Others decry what they see as German free-riding on a weaker currency than it really needs. Because it's packaged with anemic southern European economies in the Eurozone, the euro is actually far weaker than a German mark would be, giving exports a push. So all these comments are true. But the success of such measures was never preordained. In the mid-1990s, Germany's economy staggered under the twin weights of high debt and unemployment. Low costs were the highest in the labor costs, were the highest in the industrialized world, hamstringing German industry. Unemployment had surged in recently incorporated German Democratic Republic. A slew of labor market reforms, known as the Hartz reforms, that came together in the mid-2000s, did indeed help cut labor costs. The fall of the Iron Curtain has opened Eastern Europe as a source of cheap labor, strengthening the hand of employers in negotiations with unions. As a result, unions were less rigid in their demands. For example, in the 1990s, the number of so-called open clauses, which effectively allowed companies under economic strain to opt out of union contracts, surged. Less than 5% of the industry collective bargaining agreements had such clauses in 1995. By 2005, about 75% of all German firms with collective bargaining agreements included opening clauses in such deals. and they work. Like other large developed economies, Germany suffered a sharp economic contraction in 2009. But job losses were minimized, in part due to programs such as the Short Work or Kurzarbeit program, in which the government subsidized shortened work weeks for workers who would otherwise be laid off. During the worst of the recession, roughly 1.5 million German workers participated, allowing German manufacturers to keep ties to skilled workers. In recent years, some countries have tried to copy elements of German capitalism. With youth unemployment nearing 50%, Spain is looking to boost German-style apprenticeship programs. France is experimenting with measures that allow unionized companies to cut working hours and preserve jobs during downturns. Britain wants to build a Mittelstand of its own. So far, none have transformed these economies, and they likely won't. German policies function because they are designed to work in the context of the German economy and the German political culture, where institutions like trade unions and industry associations have proven uniquely effective at coordinating wages and production over time. That structure is built up over decades, if not centuries, so countries can't immediately emulate it. To be sure, the German system isn't perfect. Critics argue that what's increasingly developed is a two-speed economy in which lower-paid service workers exist in a completely different realm from insulated high-skilled workers at exporting giants. Wage inequality has surged in recent years, though it remains nowhere near the peaks of countries such as the U.S. While the unemployment has fallen to record lows, the average German worker has seen very little wage growth over the last 2 decades. Even when times are good, there's been almost no wage growth for even skilled German workers. But most importantly, it's not difficult to envision a cyclical cooling of Germany's export-driven engine. China, that we're going to be looking at here in a few lectures, is a key buyer of its capital goods, and it is in the midst of a deepening slowdown, while Germany's service sector and domestic economy remain far too undersized to help balance a fall-off in exports. Meanwhile, its core customer base within Europe continues to limp through a weak recovery. Germany could spur growth by boosting investment and increasing the terms of bailout agreements for countries such as Greece, but show little appetite for any of the above. The Germans are pursuing right now an unbelievably myopic short-term policy. It also raises problems for the future of the Eurozone, which has bestowed benefits on Germany via a relatively weak currency. Many argue that it's the euro, not the tough-minded reforms of the last decade, that's actually led to the real German success. German elite opine that German economic success is a tale of virtue rewarded, but they're particularly likely to tell you that it's a tale of virtue rewarded for keeping budget deficits low and keeping wages lower, and that for an example of a controlled capitalism, a reluctant capitalism at its best. And so, we come back, my friends, to our seminar question. Examine classic economic liberalism using contemporary or German economic policy as focus. Now, in creating your thesis statement, then, you want to collapse this entire question into one sentence, such as classic economic liberalism, its pluses and minuses, its benefits and its detractions can be seen by examining 2 unique capitalist economies, such as Japan and Germany. Okay, so that's a reasonable thesis statement. A thesis statement simply takes this question and knocks off anything that looks like a question and makes it into a declarative statement. Writing 101. So now you have your thesis statement, and from your thesis statement then you form your outline, right? So your introductory paragraph that includes your thesis statement is paragraph 1. As with this essay and all our essays, I'm looking for about 3 pages double-spaced. Okay? No, not much more, not much less. And so you have a limited amount to work with, right? Which assumes pretty solid editing, because this is a big question. Well, the first thing out of the bat, then, is to define economic liberalism, right? You're comparing economic liberalism, you're looking at it, first you have to define it. So I would argue in paragraph 2, what is economic liberalism? Well, you can go back to our Introduction to IPE lecture, where we talked about that, where we discussed that. You can go back to the earlier part of this lecture, where I tried to deepen that original definition a little bit. Or you can go to chapter 2 of your book, Introduction to International Political Economy by David Balam, and see what he has to say. My argument is to take 2 or maybe 3 paragraphs and really define what is economic liberalism, what is capitalism. Now, this question says Japanese or German economic policy as a focus. You can do both. Please, feel free. Tackle this question as you see best. But what are those elements of Japanese capitalism that seem similar to classic liberalism, and how are they different? Abenomics, right? When you look at German economic policy, you just think of corporatism and immediately you say, but corporatism can't be a part of capitalism. That's antithetical to capitalism. Exactly. So where do using these case studies, these Japanese and German case studies, then highlight the benefits of liberalism or show its problems, and how? How has Japan and Germany benefited from capitalism? How have they tweaked it to better benefit? You get it. My friends, that's 2 hours-ish, and you've done a great job of listening to me yammer on. I thank you for your patience. We will be looking forward to reading your essays and to responding to them in great detail. And thank you for your time. Have a great day.